Baodai the solution? Hello and welcome back to our little history of Indochina. Thank you to everybody who's listening out there, and thank you for people who took the time to leave us a review and a rating. It really means a lot to me, and I hope that you guys go out there as well and continue talking about the podcast. So we finished last time with Operation Leia. You know, that big military operation that was supposed to be a knockout blow for the Viet Minh. Well, it did not knock the Viet Minh out. The French had failed to cut the Viet Minh's head. They had to deal now with a new and very uncomfortable reality, a long and protracted war. They did not like that one bit. But so far, they had neglected to work on a political solution, or at least they had invested more time and effort on a military solution. What we will see today is that because Operation Leia had failed, the French decided to do everything they could to strike a deal with ex-Emperor Baodai. And that's what they called the Baodai solution. The objective of the Baodai solution was very cynical. What the French wanted was simply to drive a wedge between the Viet Minh nationalists and the Viet communists. You know, the divide and rule tactic. The French wanted to have a deal with Baodai and use him as a rallying point for what they called, quote-unquote, authentic Vietnamese nationalists, meaning everybody who was not communist. Baodai would therefore be an alternative to Ho Chi Minh, and anybody who was not a die-hard communist would desert the DRV and run to join the son of the heaven, the emperor. At least, that was a plan. Additional bonus, the French could say to the US, look, we're working here with the emperor against communism. Give us some money. The issue was though that in 1948, Baodai still wanted independence and wanted to wrest it from France. The French were not ready to give up Indochina. So how would these two positions come together? If you remember well last time, we talked about a speech that High Commissioner Bollard gave in Ha Dong in September 1947. Do you remember Baodai's reaction to that speech? Well, he agreed after the speech to enter into negotiation with France. But he made it clear that he had two demands: independence and a unified Vietnam, meaning including Cochin China that French considered a separate colony. Everybody thought then, right, negotiation would be starting immediately then. However, strangely enough, nobody heard from Baodai between September and December 1947. During that autumn, the French sent many emissaries, but Baodai stalled and did not engage at all. It was as if after saying okay, he was afraid to sit down and negotiate with the French. So the French started getting jittery. What if Baodai turned around and struck a deal with the Viet Minh? What if Baodai contacted the Americans directly? It was only in December 1947 that the former emperor finally overcame his mistrust and agreed to meet with the French High Commissioner. The meeting took place on the 7th of December in Ha Long Bay, on the same spot where Ho Chi Minh met Thierry d'Argentlieu in 1946. And this is the moment, ladies and gentlemen, where we're going to talk about the infamous Ha Long Bay Protocol. What is the Ha Long Bay Protocol? And why is it infamous? Let me tell you. Bollard and Baodai met, okay. At the end of the meeting, the two men signed two documents. The first one was a joint declaration in which France reaffirmed that Baodai was the sole interlocutor of the Vietnamese people. So far, so good. However, Bollard and the French prepared a second document dubbed a protocol. And if you're wondering what a protocol is, it is a draft that outlines the term of a treaty agreed in a conference and that is signed by the two parties. So this is the real deal. This is the minutes of the meeting if you were in a meeting with a client. Well, the protocol was odd. It contained the word independence for Vietnam, good, but it also emptied the word of all its substance. It specified that in case of quote-unquote independence, 1. France would retain diplomatic, military, financial, and monetary control of the future Vietnamese state. Secondly, France set up in the protocol a special regime for ethnic minorities because those minorities needed French protection. What it meant is that the territories where these minorities lived would remain under French control. And as you can understand, this was very far from Bao Dai's demands. And surely, the former emperor could not sign such a protocol. However, Bao Dai signed the document. And here is what he said in 1982 about the protocol. Quote, I read the protocol. I was a little bit put off because it took up the terms of what was once the protectorate. I said, no, I'm not signing. He, meaning Bolat, he told me, but I have to report to my country, to my government that I met you. I said, take a picture of the two of us and then that's enough. He told me, no, that's not enough. You would have to put your signature. I said, if that makes you happy. So instead of signing with my emperor's name, I simply signed Vin 3. End quote. You will agree that it's a bit of a flimsy explanation, isn't it? Whatever Bao Dai said 35 years later, it really looked like Bao Dai had been played by Bolat into signing the protocol. And it is no surprise that the French rushed to publicize it, and as a result, there was a general outcry all over Vietnam. The Viet Minh side, of course, rubbished the protocol. But every other nationalist rubbished it as well. The non-communists were disgusted. Remember, Bao Dai was then based in Hong Kong. Well, when he came back to Hong Kong, the nationalist leaders, the same people who had begged him to take power, well, this guy made it clear to him that they were angry. And the angriest personality then was his former minister, Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem told Bao Dai not to resume negotiations if the protocol was not amended to include the nationalist demands. Diem got personally in touch with Bolat and demanded amendments to the document. When Bolat refused, Diem said, that's it, I quit. What the French did with the protocol convinced Ngo Dinh Diem that their mindset in 1948 was the same as in 1931, when Diem himself was part of a short-lived Bao Dai cabinet that was advocating for reforms. Ngo Dinh Diem washed his hands of anything French-related, and he would only return in 1954 with one obsession: rid the country of any French presence. But Diem was not the only one criticizing Bao Dai. He was just the most extreme. The former emperor was being criticized from all sides. Everybody was hounding him with criticism. And Bao Dai could not stand the heat. And he fled to Europe, settling in the French Riviera and traveling between there, Paris, and Geneva. Bao Dai played bridge and tennis during the day, and at night the emperor visited the cabarets and the nightclubs. Of course, Bidot and other French politicians held meetings with him as well during this time, trying to coax him to come back to the negotiating table. However, Bao Dai reiterated that he would settle for nothing less than full independence of a unified Vietnam. This outraged his French interlocutors. And that outrage showed Bao Dai that the French political class was united against independence. Whether it was Ho Chi Minh or Bao Dai on the other side did not matter. But if there's one thing we learn more and more about Bao Dai, is that he always found it hard to stay the course when he confronted the French. After some time, Bao Dai stopped talking about amending the protocol. And to move forward, he made a proposition to the French. unified the Cochinchina provisional government with the administrative committees of Annam and Tonkin in one government. Bollard accepted the idea, and in May 1948, a provisional central government of Vietnam was created. And to head it, the French appointed General Nguyen Van Swan. And to seal the deal, everybody traveled again to, wait for it, Ha Long Bay. It must be for the pictures, surely. And on June the 5th, 1948, the Ha Long Bay Agreements, les Accords de la Baie de Long, allowed the creation of a unified Vietnamese government associated to France within the French Union and the Indo-Chinese Federation. These agreements were a major turning point because France, for the first time, agreed to include the words independence of a unified Vietnam in an official document. The same thing they had refused to Ho Chi Minh in Fontainebleau in 1946. The Ha Long Bay Agreements were therefore a first breach in the defensive walls of the French colonial empire. The independence of Vietnam within the French Union was recognized. However, all the points of the Protocol of December 1947 were also included in the agreements. So while the principle of the reunification of Cochinchina with Tonkin and Annam was agreed on, Cochinchina retained a different status from the other two territories and retained a separate administration. So in theory, unification, but in reality, not so. However, Bollard and General Swan signed the agreements and Bao Dai put his initials to it. But straight afterwards, once again, Bao Dai was struck with a bout of buyer's remorse. Once again, he fled to the French Riviera and went on strike. Bao Dai insisted that all of Vietnam should be reunited before he took office as chief of state. To make matters worse, the government led by General Nguyen Van Swan was weak and lacked nationalist credentials. Take the president, General Swan. Well, this guy was seen as a man of the French, and he was. He was a general in the French army. He led a government that no Vietnamese really supported or knew about. But these guys were theoretically an alternative to the Viet Minh. So Ho Chi Minh denounced the provisional government, stating that the DRV reserved itself the right to bring to justice the quote-unquote Quislings who had duped Bao Dai into signing the agreements. Ho Chi Minh used Quisling for traitor because Quisling was the name of a Norwegian Nazi collaborator. But Ho Chi Minh should not have fretted. The Swan government was impotent. It had no popular support, no territorial base, no army, and no police. It depended entirely on France. And if you add that it depended entirely on France for its finances as well, you understand that this provisional government was unable to compete with the DRV. And this was the worst case scenario for Vietnamese non-communist nationalists. The same people who had pushed Bao Dai to get involved were now just following the French. And to make things worse, the colonists in Saigon successfully lobbied the French government to declare that the agreements did not call into question Cochinchina's status as a colony. In other words, the agreement was not worth the paper it was written on. And there's more and worse. The Ha Long Bay agreements were not even debated, let alone ratified by French Parliament. And this was a massive setback for High Commissioner Bollard, who had personally negotiated the agreements. As a result, he resigned his position in September 1948. Clearly, the High Commissioner had gone too far, and the French government reiterated the principle of France's exclusive sovereignty over Indochina. So in 1948, General Nguyen Van Swan found himself at the same point as Dr. Thin when he committed suicide in 1946. His government was clearly a French puppet government, and the French were just weaponizing Viet people against the Viet Minh. And Viet Minh's propaganda ran that point very hard. With all this political to and fro, you would be forgiven if you thought that the French were no longer seeking a military solution. They actually were. The only change is that in 1948, there was no large-scale military operations. The Viet Minh was biding its time and remained hidden in the jungle. The 100,000 French soldiers under General Valui, on the other hand, focused on defending the gains they made in 1947. Here is a rough overview of the situation. Things were okay for France in the south, especially in the cities. Saigon was still partying hard, the cafes on the Rue Catinat were full, and the Cercle Sportif was still open only to French citizens. Okay, there were grenade attacks here and there, but hey, as soon as the dead were collected by ambulances, the party got started again. In the countryside, the Viet Minh stayed put in its sanctuaries in the Plain of Reeds and in the Camao Peninsula. Nevertheless, sometimes, the Viet Minh got out of those sanctuaries to launch murderous attacks. For example, on May the 1st, 1948, a Viet Minh battalion ambushed a convoy of 70 French vehicles between Saigon and Dalat. There were 82 dead and 150 civilians were taken hostages. But it was in the north that the Viet Minh was relentlessly harassing French troops. Two examples. In the Red River Delta, the Viet Minh was severely disrupting the traffic between Hanoi and the port city of Haiphong. In September 1948, for example, 4 trains were blown up by mines and 45 trucks were destroyed in 3 days on this vital road for the French. The result was an acute shortage of fuel in Hanoi during the whole month of October 1948. Another example, the region around the Chinese border. This was a very tough terrain, highlands, rough terrain, dense forests, you name it. The French had military outposts out there, but they could supply them only by air to avoid Viet Minh ambushes on the RC4, the colonial route 4. In February 1948, for example, a company of the Foreign Legion advancing on the RC4 was ambushed. The company lost 22 dead and 33 wounded, which is a whopping 40% of losses. There were about 30 similar ambushes in 1948, and the French High Command had just no answer against those ambushes. The most worrying case for the French was Bac Can. You remember that was the capital of the DRV that the French conquered in 1947 during Operation Léa. Well, after that, French paratroopers set up a garrison in the city, and until mid-1948, French military convoys were able to bring supplies to Bac Can. They paid a heavy toll, of course, in men and equipment, but they could reach Bac Can. By August 1948, though, the French completely lost control of the road leading to Bac Can, and the 600 soldiers and civilians in the outpost could only be supplied by parachuting ammunition or food in the town. Therefore, with French troops in too small numbers to carry out large-scale actions, and the Viet Minh content with guerrilla actions, an uneasy stalemate set in. And this stalemate was okay for the Viet Minh because that was exactly what they wanted. And in the background, Vo Nguyen Giap was busy building up his battalions. And by the end of 1948, he had 250,000 men at his disposal. At the same time, he mobilized the entire population in the region it controlled. Each village had units responsible for covering the territory, making sure that supply and transport ran smoothly. Each village had peasant soldiers whose responsibility it was to harass French troops. And if needed, regional troops and even regular troops could come and help. And that was the situation when the French commander, General Valui, resigned his position. He and High Commissioner Bollard did not see eye to eye, and Valui became the first of 6 French generals who would throw the towel against General Zapp. To make matters worse, another headache loomed for the French. Indeed, the long civil war between Chinese nationalists and communists had swung in favor of Mao Zedong's communists. This guy conquered Manchuria in October 1948, and in December, the communist troops had Beijing in their crosshair. Chiang Kai-shek's regime was collapsing, and the communist takeover in China was now inevitable. And this was an existential threat to French Indochina. If Mao won, it would strengthen the Viet Minh and destroy French efforts to divide the Vietnamese nationalist movement. The clock was ticking, and the French had to revive the Bao Dai solution before the communist victory in China made it irrelevant. And for this challenge, a new guy took over as High Commissioner. His name was Léon Pignon. Pignon was a civil servant, and unlike his predecessors, he had served in Vietnam for a long time, and he knew the country well. Pignon was also a fierce supporter of French Indochina. So let me tell you right away, Pignon was going to give it a red-hot go to find the Bao Dai solution, but it would be in line with what he had declared when he was in Dargelieu's cabinet, quote, "The opposition to the government of the DRV must serve the permanent interest of France." So see you in the next episode for the Pignon solution to the Bao Dai question. Until then, take care and goodbye.